And I can answer you that yes, Paula, we can hear you.
Welcome everyone to this session. Today we are here to listen to the outputs and next steps of the FAIR for Research Software Working Group. This is a joint group by the Research Software Alliance, RDA, Research Data Alliance, and Force 11. I'd like to thank the 9 chairs of this working group and all of the collaborators that have made this outcome possible. As you can see in the chat, we have collaborative notes and the slides shared for you. And while I'm doing the housekeeping and the introduction to the working group, please add your name and also please add answers to the icebreaker questions. To start this conversation, we would like to make you aware that we have a code of conduct by the RDA, and please mute yourself if you are not speaking while we are presenting. You can add your questions to the collaborative notes just to have one location to find your questions, because we are aware that we have 2 chats, and then we will try to answer them asynchronously in the collaborative notes. And be aware that this meeting is being recorded and it will be available for anyone to watch who are registered for RDA, and then in the public after 8 weeks. Welcome again to this session. If you have not been part of this working group, we would like to give you a few updates of what we've been doing in the last 2 years. For today's goal, we would like to present the final outcome, which is the definition of the FAIR principles for research software. You can find them through this DOI. You can remember RDA 00060A. That's the DOI to cite the new FAIR principles for research software. We're also going to share a few updates about the other outputs that have been constructed during the working group to aid with the definition of the FAIR4RS and also for the adoption of those principles. At the end of today's session, you will hear about the governance and the next steps of the output and where you can redirect your questions. So if you just joined, welcome again. We are doing the housekeeping. This is the agenda for today. We have 1 hour and a half session. Thanks to all of you who are waking up really early in the middle of the night, or having a cup of tea or coffee in the morning, or later at night. This session, I'm starting with the introduction. You are doing the icebreaker questions in the collaborative documents. And then I'm going to do very quickly a review of the community process that we've managed to collaborate with about 500 people to bring this output to you. Then Neil is going to present the FAIR principles and a little bit of the reasoning, why they came about. And then Dan and I and Tom are going to present the guidelines and some stories of early adopters. And at the end, Moran is going to wrap up this discussion with conclusions and next steps. Okay, so I'll give you another 2 minutes if you just join to go to the icebreaker questions and add your final thoughts. I'm trying to multitask here, but I think I might be able to share.
Paula, we've lost the slides and got your desktop.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to share the notes, but it seems it's a bit hard now. Do you see my slides again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just to give you some time, I wanted to review what the answers are, but I think we can do that at the end in the wrap-up, so people also have a bit more time to engage with those questions. So I'm going to continue with the introduction to follow the agenda. As As you are aware, the FAIR principles for all digital objects were published in 2016. And then this group came together because there was a lot of community process in trying to translate those FAIR principles into research software. And the motivation of why we started this process is because software is not just data, and it's not just the type of digital output that that we can really translate to the word the FAIR principles for data. So we also work collaborative in other documents, and we like to cite in the motivation two of them. From 2020, there is a FAIR practice task force in EOS, and they had some recommendations. And recommendation number 5 was that we need to recognize that the FAIR guidelines require translation to other digital objects to support FAIR. Also in 2019, there was an opportunity note by the French National Committee of Open Science for Free Software and Open Source Project Group by Clemens Fontaine 2019. And they also had some recommendations, and the recommendation number 2 is to make sure that the specific nature of software it's contextualized in the discussion of FAIR data. So these are two motivations that led to the formation of this group. And we started this in 2019. By September of 2020, we had a group with more than 50 participants, and we had our case statement endorsed, and we were ready to start with 2 main goals. The first one was to define and effectively apply the FAIR principles for research software, and the second one was to achieve adoption of these principles. We've worked together during the first 6 months doing pre-work with subgroups. Then we started defining the principles, and kind of at the same time we started doing a lot of consultations and reviews to the final output of version 1 of the FAIR4RS. We have completed our work in March. We still have a few things to review after the community review. And then we were finally approved as an RDA endorsed output in May 2022. And now this is one of our last presentations. To go more in details about the output, I would like to refer to one of the definitions that we came together as a group. Subgroup 2 was working on the definition of research software, and I am going to explain that to you, read the definition for you. Research software includes source code files, algorithms, scripts, computational workflows, and executables were created in either of 2 categories. So mainly within a research project as a byproduct to do research, or through intentional development of a software product for general use in research by one or more projects. With this definition, we started translating the FAIR principles for research software. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of pre-work before the definition during 2020 and 2021. And then during 2021, we did 3 rounds of consultations. First within the group, then we did sprints with people who wanted to be more involved. Then we did a review within the steering committee, and then we opened it up as a community review with the 3 hosting organizations of the FAIR4RS, which are the RDA, RISA, and Force 11. That's when we had a lot more feedback, and we prepared our submission. In March, we submitted to the RDA for endorsement, and in May, the principles were published, and you can find them through the DOI RDA 00068. Through the development of the FAIR principles, we intentionally have some considerations. And the first one is that we did not want to change the FAIR guiding principles. We took them as a starting point. And why we did this is to maximize the value of formally scholarly digital publishing, and to recognize the value of research software to ensure transparency, reproducibility, and reusability. the FAIR principles are aspirational, and I know that you all know, but we really took this as an important point. This is a transition. We had many steps into applying the FAIR principles and many discussions. So this is not just a checkbox like a lot of people ask from us. It's a path that you are advancing towards more FAIR. And then again, the consideration that was the motivation to define the FAIR principles is that software encompasses many forms, and it also benefits different users. And we put this very aware, this consideration as a main one when defining the reusability. And in here we attend to the users that just want to execute a software and don't need to know how it works, but others who are really wanting to reuse it more, they need to have access to the source code as well. And then finally, the software engineering practices that exist and are relevant to the FAIR4RS principles, they are considered, but they are not cited within the principles, although everyone who is involved in research software should look at best practices. Now I'm gonna hand over to Neil to present to you in more detail what the FAIR principles are and the discussions that we had in the group.
Thanks very much, Paula. So yes, my name is Neil Chu-Hong, and I'm going to be summarizing the published FAIR principles for research software and give you all some context about some of the decisions that were made during the community consultation process that Paula has described to incorporate the feedback that we got from the community and take in the work of the different subgroups of the FAIR for Research Working Group into consideration in the way that we structured and worded the principles. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. So one of the biggest challenges that we had when we were putting together the FAIR for Research software principles is that a large proportion of the community is really just looking for a checklist that they can follow. And as Paula mentioned, FAIR is not something that is binary. It's something where there are a number of stages to fairness. And what we've got to do is balance the difference between providing principles that give a direction with giving guidance that would only work in particular situations. So we were creating general principles that can be taken by different communities to turn into concrete guidance. And this challenge of guiding without giving guidance that only works in particular situations was one of the trickiest parts of putting together the FAIR for Research software principles. That goes hand in hand with the difficulty of jargon, and in particular ensuring that the wording that we used was generally understandable to people coming from a very broad audience. We had to be careful to ensure that we explained any terms that we used, and as you'll see, there are some things which perhaps have different meanings and definitions depending on the communities that you come from. So that feeds into the wording of the principles, trying to understand how to ensure that there's clarity in the way that they are understood. And also one decision that was made as a result of the community consultations was moving away from modal language, so the musts, the shoulds, towards aspirational descriptions. Where do we want people to go when they're making software findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, rather than saying someone must do something or should do something? And finally, as has been the case all the way through this working group, we want to make sure that the community has engaged with the development of the principles and that the decisions that we've taken are explained. And a large part of that was responding to the various comments that we got in through the different community consultations, the different surveys, and the formal consultation through the RDA website. So I'm now going to go on and talk a bit about the FAIR principles themselves, and I'm going to go through each of the foundational principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and talk about how it differs from the FAIR principles for data. And if you want to find out a little bit more about that, this is all described in the published document, and in particular in Appendix B, there's a table that lists the differences not only between the published principles for FAIR for research software, but also the FAIR data principles and some of the other intermediary steps along the way of the FAIR principles for research software. So the first principle, findable, is defined as software and its associated metadata is easy for both humans and machines to find. So this is not altered very much from the FAIR principles for data. We have extended principle F1 that around the assignment of globally unique and persistent identifiers to have two sub-principles that recognize the importance of software granularity and the fact that you may want to identify components of software at different levels of granularity. So perhaps a function or a library or an application. And also that there's an importance attached to versions of software and that it is important to assign these distinct identifiers. The other thing that's slightly different here is a recasting of the fourth principle to metadata are FAIR, searchable, and indexable. This basically takes in some things that were previously in one of the principles around interoperability for data and ensures that what we're looking to do is support the different infrastructure that might come to support the findability of software. So in particular, what we are looking at is ensuring that metadata is harvestable and accessible, for instance, in use by search engines or registries, and also that the metadata can be used to support different practices, which we believe are important for research, including the citation of software. Can you go on to the next slide, please? For accessible, we define that foundational principle as software and its metadata is retrievable via standardized protocols. So this is the principle that is least changed from the data ones. And in part, that's because we're taking the same definition of accessibility that the FAIR principles for data takes. There is another definition in software engineering of accessibility as being the ability to use software regardless of possible impairments. So, for instance, accessibility for those who are visually impaired. And for the FAIR principles for research software, what we've done is choose to use that definition of accessibility as part of the reusability principle. So I'll come back to that when we get to reusable. So as I mentioned, these are generally unchanged from the way that they're described for data as well. It's still about ensuring that software can be retrieved by its identifier using standardized communications protocols. And in most cases now, software is always retrieved via a small number of protocols, things like HTTP and HTTPS or FTP. A key thing here is the understanding of how authentication and authorization procedures might be part of this accessibility of the software. So for instance, the principles would support the ability of there to be authentication via, for instance, a license server for the software. And the second principle, that metadata are accessible even when the software is no longer available, is even more important for software, given that in many cases, software becomes unusable through time if it's not maintained. So it's important to understand the description of the software, its functionality, for instance, even when the software is no longer able to be used. So I'll move on now to interoperability, if you'd like to move to the next slide. Thanks, Paula. So we define interoperable for software as being software interoperates with other software by exchanging data and or metadata, and/or for interaction via application programming interfaces described through standards. And so this foundational principle is probably the one that has changed most from the way it is defined in the FAIR principles for data. We've placed an emphasis on domain-relevant data formats and mechanisms here in the first of these principles, saying that software reads, writes, and exchanges data in a way that meets domain-relevant community standards. So what we're seeking to ensure here is that that people who are developing software that's used in research are indeed using things like openly available formats and, where possible, open APIs to ensure that as much as possible, it's easy for different pieces of software to interoperate. We've also said that software should include qualified references to other objects. And here, what we mean is, for instance, software may have different dependencies that it relies on, not just software dependencies, but perhaps things that we want to be able to describe. So for instance, what programming languages perhaps that a piece of software is written in, or perhaps it is around the files that it requires to run, or the functionality that is present in it. So this is related to some of the other principles I mentioned around the metadata being indexable as well as part of F4. So here, what we've done is split some of the things that used to be in the interoperable principle and move them into the findable principle, but also ensuring that the fairness of metadata includes the fact that we need to understand the way that software interacts with other FAIR objects. So finally, I'll move on to reusable. So we've defined reusable as software is both usable, it can be executed, and reusable. It can be understood, modified, built upon, or incorporated into other software. And so here there are some changes to the way that things are interpreted from the data principles, but you'll see that the principles themselves look very much similar, the guiding principles here. So again, we want software to be described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. And we still want software to be given a clear and accessible license. And here we note that we're not saying it's necessarily an open license, but we would hope that in the spirit of the FAIR principles, as they were originally written, that some things are as open as possible and as closed as necessary. We also say that software is associated with detailed provenance. And here we want to go beyond simply the recording of what files may have changed, but that, to ensure that the provenance includes details of the intent and decisions that have been taken as software has been developed. For software, it's important that they include qualified references to other software. And in particular here, we are talking about software dependencies. And finally, we're saying that software must meet domain-relevant community standards. And this encompasses a large number of different things. For instance, it could encompass the accessibility from a software engineering perspective that I mentioned. So it might be about software meeting standards around web accessibility or around internationalization and localization. It might include things like different types of documentation or programming styles. But the important thing here is that it is domain relevant and a community standard. So it has to be something that comes out from the community that the software is serving. And that's because different communities will have different priorities, whether it is around, for instance, standards to do with the way that software is released, or indeed standards to do with the way that software is written. And here we're really kind of getting to the hardest part of the FAIR for Research software principles. And that's going from the principles themselves, which are intended to guide and give a direction, to the way that each community will choose to interpret, implement, and adopt these principles. So I'll go on to the final slide for this section. So one question is, who is responsible for FAIR software and why are they responsible? So in the FAIR Principles for Research Software, we've stated that the application of the principles is the responsibility of the owners of the software, who are often the creators or developers, and not the users. So it's up to the people who are producing and publishing the software to ensure that as much as possible, the FAIR principles are applied. However, they're also relevant to a much larger system of stakeholders, including, for instance, the people who support repositories and registries, the people who may be using software in different way to integrate it or create applications that build upon it. And so what we see that is this is a cycle, and it's an adoption cycle that includes many different parts, from ensuring that we have the policy and the principles to enable people to understand what they should be doing, the infrastructure that will help support it, such as registries that make things more findable, the training and tools that make it easier to apply the FAIR principles, the different norms from the communities that will ensure that people follow the FAIR principles, and finally the incentives, the things that will enable people to not just apply them because they have to, but apply them because they get something out of it. And so all of this is around the adoption of the FAIR principles. And what I'm going to do now is pass over to Dan to start talking around what communities have been adopting the FAIR principles as early adopters and where we need to go next in terms of the governance and further discussion of how we create FAIR for research software.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Paula is actually going to start the section.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Neil, for describing the principles in more detail. We are going to have a little pause for people to ask questions before we go to the adoption guidelines and support.
I see already some questions in the chat, but it's in the Zoom chat and not in the Wova chat. So I'm going to read you the chat. Well, first, there's a comment by Dimitri. It's not related to FAIR4RS, but it seems puzzling to make it possible after making it mandatory, even if it is usually the actual situation. Neil, do you have a comment about that? Can you read your comment out loud? Because Neil has just answered in the chat. Well, for Simon's question, right? So Simon's question is about open license. Is there a recommendation? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't hear Neil.
Yes.
Okay, so I was asking, Neil, can you answer your answer from the chat in the
sorry.
for everybody
Yes,
to
just so
listen?
it's on the recording.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, so there was a question about open licenses, whether there's a recommendation. So there isn't a recommendation in the FAIR for Research Software Principles document. And that's partly because, as I mentioned, this is one of the things where each community will have slightly different priorities around things like licenses. However, there are a number of very good general guidance already in existence from different organizations around choosing open source licenses, which we'd recommend. So in particular, There's one called choosealicense.com, which is from, I believe, GitHub, and they provide that, which has some very simple questions. And recently, there's also been one that has been produced for European projects as well, which I'll try and find and put into the chat so it can be captured in the notes.
Thank you, Neil. Do we have another comment here from Dan? Dan, do you want to say out loud your comment?
Well, I was just I guess I was trying to answer Dimitri, who in some sense is looking at the fact that this is a cycle, and that in some ways, depending on where you start, you may have something that looks a little bit odd from the point before that to that point. So I don't know. I guess I'm just saying that this diagram is a little bit problematic in some sense as a set of dependencies, which isn't really probably what happened. Probably these things happen kind of all at the same time, ideally.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dan. I have another comment from Paul about the license, that the principle is to add a license and not that the choice of the license. I can add something from my experience with the French institution. So it's not really the author that has the license, but the property owner that has the right on the license. So if you are a researcher in an institution, you should verify that with the services that are dedicated to valorization of the code of the software products.
Yeah, I guess I'll add that unfortunately in a lot of institutions, you probably know more about what the impact of different licenses are than the person you might ask. And unless they think that there's money to be made, they probably won't care.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Are there any other questions before we go to the other segment of this session? I see that Neil has added the link for the EU license chooser. If you want to take that, and we can add it also in the notes later on to keep these links. I don't see any hands raised. Other questions, maybe? If not, we can move on to the adoption guidelines and support.
Can you see the slides now?
Yeah, we can see the slide. Thank you, Paolo.
Good. Okay. The following three outputs that you are going to hear about are those that have been built while we were defining the FAIR principles, but to aid in the support and adoption of the FAIR4RS. The first one was Subgroup 5, and the Subgroup 5 was trying to do a list of guidelines for to help in the adoption of the FAIR principles. This subgroup was led by me, by Sandra Hessing, by Leila Castro, and Chris Ehrman. And we had about 30 participants in the group. What the group was set to do is to have a collection of adoption guidelines, and we have to bear in mind that the collection of these guidelines was prior to the final version of the FAIR principles for research software. So most of them are aligned in the ethos of making research software more reusable, more transparent, but they don't align to all of the principles as they were not defined when these products were put in the public. The set of guidelines that we collected are about 30 resources, and we separated into 4 different categories, and those are guidelines, tools, metadata schemas, and software registries. What's important to note here is that although we collected 30 resources and we've separated into the different years, the different providers. We had a bit of a analysis of how they align to the FAIR principles for research software in the main 4 acronyms on findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. But also we created a space for new resources to be added. So we know that now that the principles are being discussed, used, and adopted, there's going to be new resources created around those FAIR principles. So there is a place via the DOI link on this slide where you can add your resources, and we created a tag, so all the resources that were previously collected will have a different tag from the new resources. Some of the examples that I can cite between the guidelines are from publications, short publications that explain mainly authors of research software, how to make the research software more visible. So that helps to findability. It also helps on guiding people with the last question that we had about choosing a license, for example, and some of the documentation that people need to add into making the research software more available for other people to reuse. In the tools, we have about 4 examples, and those are tools that were created in trying to have some kind of metric around how fair is your software. So depending on the tool that you are using, there might be different metrics, and because the FAIR principles are not just a checkbox and it's a process, the assessment of the FAIR principles or for research software might be different between the tools. But it's one of the gaps that we identified, that metrics for research software is something that we would like other groups to start working on after the definition. Between the metadata schemas, the one to highlight is code meta, and the crosspaths that code meta is enabling between different software registries. So they can understand the information from a domain-specific software registry or probably an institutional software registry. In between the examples, there is a list that the Netherlands Science Center is collecting. It's still open for additions, where you can see software registries via programming language and also by domain. I also like to mention here SciCodes, which is the consortium for research software registries, has now decided to have open participation. So if you are one of the software registries repository managers, or if you are interested in metadata schemas for research software, you can join SciCodes to continue the conversation. The document also has discussed software findability as a social and infrastructure gap. And one of the initiatives that came out of that gap identified is that we are trying to understand better how researchers find software in order to give some guidelines for repository managers to put those main metadata in front and also make them interoperable with other repositories. So information can be shared across different repositories and also merged by aggregators. At the end of this report, you also have a list of emerging resources. So the report was published at the end of last year in December, and by that time there were some organizations that already committed to be early adopters of the FAIR principles, and then it's going to mention a little bit more about the organizations. But in this report you can see some of the efforts that they are committing to produce, for example metrics, other guidelines, self-assessment, and doing webinars and socialization of the FAIR principles. So please have a look to the report and also add any new resources that you have available to the dataset collection. Now I will hand over to Dan to talk about the adopters.
Okay, thank you, Paula. As you heard, we initially started off with 4 subgroups that did a bunch of work, and then after the initial kind of draft of the principles, we have these additional 3 subgroups. Paula just talked about the 5th one. I'm going to talk about the 6th one, and then Tom is going to talk about the 7th one. So the 6th of these subgroups was looking at adoption support. And Carlos Martinez Ortiz and I led this group. And what we were trying to do was to identify and to start working with some projects that were already starting to follow the FAIR research software, FAIR research software guidelines, to start working with different kinds of organizations that were willing to adopt them, to identify and start working with funders that were willing to stimulate adoption of the guidelines, and then to write up some examples of how the guidelines were being adopted, or at least the plans for doing so. And so we published a report on Zenodo earlier this year, and we go on to the next slide. I can talk about basically the groups that we put into the report that provided information to us. And then after this, in 3 more slides, I'm going to go through 3 examples in a little more detail of these groups. So first we had, we were, I think, reasonably successful in finding societies and networks. You can see there are 4 listed there, ranging from basically disciplinary to more standards-based, and 2 in the US, kind of 2.5 in the US, one in Europe, and 1 that's kind of half global as well. We found 2 funding agencies that were beginning work in Canada and in the Netherlands. We found some software projects, again, 1 in earth science and 1 in life sciences coming out of Elixir. And then we also found some institutions that were willing to start work, and all 4 of these, coincidentally or not, are in Europe. But in general, I think we had kind of a nice mix of places in different disciplines and different countries and different kinds of organizations. So next, please. Okay, so one of these is the American Geophysical Union, as I mentioned previously. What AGU is actually doing is they're building and providing material in terms of outreach and training to the community of geoscientists that it represents on how to improve metadata and documentation for software, and how to make the metadata and the software itself fairer. AGU is providing guidance that in particular stresses the importance of using DOIs for software citation, credit, and discovery. As probably everybody knows, the natural inclination of developers that haven't really thought about this is to share GitHub URLs. And so AGU is just trying to talk about permanent identifiers rather than temporary URLs. AGU is also a publisher. And so in that role, they've been able to provide instructions to their authors about how they should preserve their software in a repository and what kind of metadata they should actually be putting into the paper, into the availability statement in particular, in AGU's terminology. So it's both the preserved version of the software as well as a link to where the software is being actively developed. So you might think of this as a link to an archived version of software in Zenodo, and then a link to the live version that's on GitHub, or it could be software heritage in GitLab, or some other combination. They also have been providing guidance that stresses the importance of software citation, and then kind of talks about how to do it as an in-text mention in the availability statement, and then as either a citation or a reference, depending on your terminology, in the references section of the paper. And then finally, they've also been thinking about Jupyter and R notebooks and what in particular is needed for those. Okay, so that's AGU. On to the next. Okay, so the Digital Research Alliance of Canada has been working on inaugural funding opportunities that align with the FAIR principles, and do so for research software development and management. The Alliance has written a research software position paper and a strategic plan, And these include support for the adoption of best practices in research software development and management, which includes the FAIR principles for research software. And they talk about supporting these throughout the research lifecycle, as well as providing support to build and sustain a strong and vibrant research software community. And so the initiatives that are discussed are promoting the impact and value of research software as a first-class research object, with the intent of facilitating cultural change in the adoption of open science practices, supporting the long-term access to and preservation of research software. And then finally, and most importantly, in some sense to developers, providing targeted and sustained funding for both developing new software and sustaining existing research software as well as platforms. Okay, so that's an example of a funder, and then we'll go on to the last example. So the Netherlands eScience Center is an institution that both develops software as well as supports the development of software and collaborations. And what they're doing is using the FAIR for Research software principles to support the creation of reusable software as part of its projects, as well as part of its calls, because it provides resources to others as well as doing work itself. So an example of this is that all projects that are funded by the center are required to have software management plans now. The eScience Center is also contributing to the development of the skills that are needed in order to implement this through skills and knowledge development activities. And these include digital skills training, development of practical guidelines, for example. The digital skills program that the eScience Center has helps to develop some of these necessary skills with the intent of not just developing good software, but developing good software that's also as reusable as possible. And then finally, is the eScience Center has taken an active role in promoting the principles in relevant policy agendas at both the national and international level. So this includes updating what they had produced previously, the 5 recommendations for FAIR software website, and the How FAIR Is activity, which assesses compliance with these recommendations. And the eScience Center is also collaborating with NWO, the Dutch Research Council, to create national templates for software management plans with, again, the goal of making software FAIR as part of those management plans, as a stage within those management plans. Okay, so I think that's my part, and then we'll go over to Tom.
Right, so the governance subgroup activity was about clarifying the governance mechanisms for the FAIR for Research Software principles from release onwards via some standard explanatory text. So this was done in order to give adopters confidence that this is a stable output. And what this subgroup was not was the establishment of an initial governing group for the principles. And it was also not about policing how the principles are interpreted, translated, or adopted. It is only about the specific wording of the recommendation from this working group, otherwise known as the FAIR Principles for Research Software, or FAIR4RS principles. But an additional outcome for the subgroup was to establish the maintenance home, or clarify the maintenance home for the FAIR4RS principles, which is a requirement for concluding an RDA working group. Now, principles have some room for interpretation, as we've heard, but we wanted to ensure that if problems or concerns arose as the principles began to be adopted, then it should be clear to adopters how they can raise concerns and what the protocols would be for changing or updating the principles, should that be necessary. So providing clear text, clarifying this information, and ensuring it is spread across the relevant channels was essentially the core task for this subgroup. In what was an experiment for Chen and I, the subgroup was run entirely asynchronously. That is, we did it without Zoom calls in order to cater to all the time zones represented across the members of the group. To do this, a much longer document was drafted with several questions posed to the group and rounds of responses captured. And where this discussion was not resolved in the document, as majority positions, the specific suggestions were not carried forward. Where the subgroup was split on an outcome, we shifted the conversation to email to produce a faster turnaround on a resolution. So the final points carried forward were then summarized into 4 statements that made up the final text, clarifying expectations and arrangements relating to the governance. This standard text has been inserted into a few locations for consistent messaging, especially on the landing page for the principles themselves. And on the next slide, the wording is as follows. The FAIR4RS principles were the outcome of broad, inclusive, and extensive public consultation, co-led by members of the Research Data Alliance, Research Software Alliance, and Force 11. Any revisions or changes to the principles will require a similar process. No single institution or body has ownership over the recommendations of the FAIR4RS working group. The RDA Software Source Code Interest Group is the maintenance home for the principles. Concerns or queries about the principles can be raised at RDA plenary events co-organized by the Software Source Code Interest Group, where there may be opportunities for adopters to report back on progress. In order to better facilitate adoption, the form of the principles will remain fixed for 2 years from the release of a first version. And after 2 years, a broadly consultative and open review will be conducted to consider if the form of the principles are still appropriate and meeting the aims of the community. The Research Software Alliance has agreed to lead this review effort in collaboration with Research Data Alliance and Force 11 members and any additional bodies relevant at that time. So that's me done, and I think we're now handing over to Moran.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe before moving to the next steps, which is the last part of this session, let's see if we have some questions from the audience. I didn't see anything in the chat, which is about questions, but Dimitri has shared a link where a French translation was prepared by a few members of the FAIR4RS Software Working Group. And it's on a branch, so you should snoop around if you're interested in the translation into French. I'm not sure how many French speakers we have today in our session. I see Paula. Yes, Paula?
Also highlight for the people who are watching the recording that it is a good outcome if other people would like to translate into other languages as well.
Very good comment. I agree. Also for the adoption and governance, it's good to have translations. And as Tom said, the maintenance of this work is going into the Software Source Code Interest Group. For this plenary, we don't have a session of the Software Source Code Interest Group, but we might propose sessions in the next plenaries. And if there's any questions about the maintenance or about that option work, this is a time for you to ask those questions. And if not, we will move it on to the next steps, which is related to the FAIR4RS Software Working Group, but not in the work of this working group. So I see there's no questions, maybe one in the chat. Anyone in the chat? No, no questions.
Moran, can I highlight something?
Yes, of course.
For people who are coming to this group as new individuals interested in the FAIR4RS, we are wrapping up. So we had the limited time, about 2 years, to produce the outputs. We have produced the outputs, and now the group is going to close. So if you go to the address in RDA FAIR4RS group, it's going to redirect you to the Software Source Code Interest Group to continue the conversation. We're not asking any more people to join as members, but to join the Software Source Code, and then you'll receive news or any other work that is going to arise from the FAIR4RS definition.
It's very good you highlighted that. I agree that's important information. This is the last session for the FAIR4RS Software Working Group, and we are wrapping up. So for the next steps, I'm going to ask Paula to move to the next slide. We had this diagram created in subgroup 1 to show how FAIR can be attained, but what we want is more than just FAIR. So if you look, it's a very complicated diagram because you have a lot of items in it. So the first one starts with identifiable, and then the second one with FAIR metadata. And it increases the fairness of the software if you go from left to right. And you can have a FAIR artifact right in the middle, but it will not be as well. You can have more than just FAIR. FAIR is good, but we might have a bigger dream for the software to have it more than just FAIR. And the FAIR principles that doesn't recover all of these. So this is why this diagram shows it's important not only to have FAIR principles and have the software as a FAIR piece of software, but it should be more than just FAIR. So you can have full access to the source code if it's open source, and you need to add some other elements if you want this software to be reproducible. Next slide, please. And so we can ask ourselves, what is it takes in order of difficulty, which is beyond FAIR? We want software to be archived, because if the software artifacts are not properly archived, we can't retrieve them for reproducibility. We want to have a possibility to reference those artifacts. Without a proper reference, we can identify these also for reproducibility. A PID can identify a record, a software record, but it doesn't mean that we will have a reference to the software artifact itself. So yes, in the FAIR principles, this is part of the FAIR principles, but these also are important things to think about when looking at reproducibility matters. Then the describe, which is properly described, which is completely covered or relatively covered in the FAIR4RS software principles. And finally, which is not covered, is the citation. FAIR software article must be properly cited to give credit to authors. And this is something that's not covered in the FAIR principles or in the FAIR4RS software principles. Next slide, please. And so this is a self-promoting slide that I've put in because I didn't introduce myself. I'm Moran Green-Peter. I work in the software heritage team in the Indria Research Center, and we are a universal source code archive proposing this solution to archive all software source code that is publicly available. Next slide. And if you didn't know that, you can save any code now, because sometimes there's some code that you find on the internet, like a website that you would like to save, that you can do with the Internet Archive. So we propose the same solution for software source code. So you go into this link that you have, save.softwareheritage.org. You choose the origin type, which can be a Git, can be a Mercurial, can be SVN, Subversion, and put the origin URL and submit this code to be saved. So if you want to save code, it's not yours, but you can also save your code. It depends on you. And here also I've added a link about how to archive and reference your code, which is guidelines for this. Yes, you can move it to the next slide. It's just guidelines on how to use the software heritage platform and interface. And so, wrapping up this session, we propose to you a small activity on the document. So not here in the chat, but in the document. So if you didn't go to the document, this is the time to write your name in the participants list and then continue downwards into the document itself. And I have 3 questions for you in the table. So I saw that for the icebreaker, it worked fantastically. And I see that it also works for the activity. The 3 questions that you can answer. You don't have to answer all of it, but it will be interesting for us. And I think that we can also learn from each other if there's some links that are added. So first, do you or your organization create software or use software? Then do you or your organization follow institutional or community best practices with the software source code you create? So here the links are welcome if you do follow some best practices. And finally, do you or your organization use the FAIR4RS software principles? And or do you plan on using it? So if this is actually the one question I'm most curious about, I think that all the chair that are present here are very curious about this question to see how it will be used, if it will be used. And I do think that we had a very good run with this working group, a lot of community consultations. So I think that the FAIR principles, as they are now, are ready for the community to use. And it will be interesting to see if here in this session we have some maybe adoption use cases that we haven't had yet. So you had the ones that we saw already. Yes. I heard someone, so I thought maybe someone wanted to say something for the audio.
I didn't hear anything, actually.
Okay. I will give you a minute or two to answer that. If someone wants to jump in and say something live, you're welcome to do so. If you prefer raising a hand before, you can do that as well. I'm watching the participants list if you want. Oh, I see a hand. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
I can't hear you.
Okay. Can other people?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure. As I put in the chat, I think it's using the principles is actually relatively, I think, challenging in an organization that's multidisciplinary and collaborative, where it would be much simpler if we were just writing our own software, or even just writing software in one particular discipline. So some of the challenges that we face are that we work in collaborative teams and we can't tell people in other institutions what practices they should follow. We have to kind of gradually come to some agreement about what practices any one project is going to use. And if a project is in one discipline where that discipline has some kind of community standard, that's great. But then we will have the same developer working in a different discipline that may have a different set of standards. And so, so I think this is actually really challenging. And I guess my hope is that as funders have requirements and as communities come to consensus, this will make it a lot easier for us as a collaborative development organization to do things where it's actually relatively hard for us to do things on our own.
Thank you, Dan. That's a very important comment.
I think
that yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think we need to do everything all at once, though, as well. And I think that there are tangible steps that software developers and engineers can take now. And there are things that are, you know, much harder in amongst the list. So we can begin to move towards a fairer state, even if the policy environment is not there yet. And I guess the other thing I was going to say is, yes, in some senses, it's easier for, well, it's both harder and easier for policy makers to adopt principles until they begin to see some normative practice occurring amongst developers as well.
Thank you, Tom. Do we have any comment about that, about this challenge?
I see Neil's hand.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up to both Dan and Tom, I think it is a very good comment that Dan makes, but it is one that I think has been with us before the FAIR principles, and what I hope is that the FAIR principles will help to, as Tom says, to kind of give different kind of pointers, different steps that can be used to start addressing it. I'm sort of reminded about the way that people have chosen in larger projects or collaborative projects around the way that we use, for instance, code repositories, from the type of version control we use to the location of the repository itself. And all of these things are things that help make software fair, but they're things that need to be done in iterative processes amongst the different organizations. And it will be hard, but I think if you do have the right incentives, the right tooling and so on, that it becomes easier to adopt them. So yeah, I don't think it's something where all of a sudden you flick a switch and the next day everything is working perfectly. It's very much an incremental process.
I completely agree with that, an incremental process towards better situation, which FAIR is part of that. Any other comment? I'm looking at the participants list now to see any hand, if any hand is raised. But you can jump in since we are in the activity part of this. I see that there are some interesting answers on the document, so I invite you to go to the document. I see some are planning to raise awareness on the FAIR4 research software principles and gradually move towards using the principles. Here is one about the diffusion of the principles in the French community. And I see that we don't have any links for other community guidelines, but I do see later on community guidelines, software source code community guidelines, Java, Python, R. So I think that's a good way to see that people do use some guidelines, and even if the challenge is a big challenge, moving towards using guidelines, best practices, and the FAIR principle is what's best. Do we have any questions here before we wrap up this session and thank everybody? Any comment, question, maybe a comment on the working group work? Paula, yes, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I have a question for the people who are present and those who are watching the recording. I've been aware that now our research software management plans based on data management plans, and I think that discussion is starting, and if someone here would like to share what they know about them. And also one of the ideas that crossed my mind is that maybe we can add those to the list of guidelines because they are related and they might be supporting also the FAIR principles for research software.
Thank you, Paula. Has anyone an answer? From the audience, not from us, from the chairs. Maybe people that will watch the recording will have more insight on that. And we can invite them to write maybe on the software source code interest group. I think that the mailing list is still open for the FAIR4RS software working group, even if the group is closed. So we will receive emails. I see a question in the chat about the joint session. Yes, we have a joint session. Can I tell more about this session? Yes, I can. It will be very interesting. There are some other practices more about publication and citation, more about citation in the joint session. I don't have other information to give right now. Maybe Neil, you have some more information.
Or Tom may as well, I think.
But
Okay.
so the other aspect that we'll be exploring in that session is the extension of the Scholix schema, which currently describes links between papers and data sets. And one area of exploration for supporting FAIR software is to formalize the capture of links between papers and software, and possibly even data sets and software, or vice versa as well.
Thank you, Tom. So we have this session, yes?
Also, I'd like to mention that we have an adoption and output session at the end of today, which is very early in Europe. So many of the working groups that are finishing the outcomes are going to present for 10 minutes. So for those of you here, you're welcome to join, and invite other people to join as well.
Thank you, Paula. Yes, there's this session as well. And there was a question if you can assist the joint session. Yes, so it's part of the plenary, of course. It's a joint session with different working groups. And you are all invited if you are awake. It will be very early for Europe. Not a lot of time to sleep. I will be there. I think Tom will be there as well. Not sure if Neil and Dan are coming to this session.
No, it's unfortunately too late for me.
Okay. Yes, we are a friendly bunch. There's another session, Birds of a Feathers, on, I don't know how to give you the time zone of that session. It will be very late tomorrow for me, or very early the next day, between Wednesday and Thursday, about publication workflows. Maybe
right,
someone wants to give a few words about that. Yes, Dan.
Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say that there's also another session that's in some like 25 hours after this session that's looking at fairness, which will include some brief discussion about FAIR for software, but also some discussion about FAIR for machine learning models.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe we should add these links in the chat here, in the chat of the WUVA. Maybe it will be accessible even after we close this this window, the Zoom window. So I will add the join session link and the BOF session link. And if you want, then you can add the other session. ML.
And if I could go back in time too, there have been several very interesting sessions on reproducibility, and a general sense that across the plenary, speaking from the luxury of being in the time zone that it's being held in, a general sense that that it is time to start paying attention to software in greater detail, and that it has a very solid relationship to data, in the research world as well. So it's been an exciting International Data Week in that regard.
Wow, impressive. Thank you, Tom, for sharing that. I'm very glad to hear it. I see another. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, actually, Paula, maybe you can speak to that.
Simon's question, the official presentation? Oh.
Yep.
Okay. No, the official presentation is today, it's now, and at 9:45, I think UTC is the short presentation of the FAIR4RS. So it's just a 10-minute presentation to explain an overview of what the group has done in the past 2 years, how we've worked together, and what are our outputs. So please join that session. It's together. It's a 15-minute time session for each of the different groups who are wrapping up, and we are the last one to present.
Yeah.
Paula, can.
Sorry, Moran. Yeah, so I mean, that is just for people who are new to the RDA. What they do at the end of plenary is that they have a kind of lightning tour of what outputs have been produced in the since the last plenary, and that output and impacts session is a chance to rip through all of the different working groups and interest groups that have had tangible outputs, so that you can stay on top of that. And I'm being neglectful of my other heavy involvement in a working group by saying that there is we're also presenting a set of 10 things for curation of reproducible and fair research, and that output does actually cross-reference both the FAIR data principles and the FAIR principles for research software in every area that we cover. It's a set of guidelines for people who are curating what we call research compendia, which is a combination of data and software, such that it can reproduce results. So that will be in the output session as well. Yeah, I think it will be the same time as this session in 24 hours, or less than 24 hours, that will be held as well.
Thank you, Tom. Paula, can you move to the other slide so we can thank everyone? So first, thank you for being here at maybe very strange hour of the day. Maybe not, but thank you. And thanks to all the people that were involved in the working group. We had a lot of members and a lot of contributions to the FAIR4RS software outputs. We had a variety of outputs that you can find on the RDA webpage, which is still existing after the wrap-up of this working group. So you can go and check out all the different outputs there. We have also Zenodo kind of collection for the FAIR4RS software working group outputs. I'm going to also mention that we had support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, and thank the steering committee and all the chairs of this working group for really the engagement in this working group, because it was the first time in the RDA that I really saw a working group working so much on the different outputs together, meeting every month to discuss FAIR4RS software discussions. We have 5 minutes left. In these 5 minutes, you can ask a question, give a comment. We added also in the document a feedback part if you want to give feedback on the session, on the working group in general, if you were here and if you want to share your thoughts with us. I see no new real comments. And yes, I hear someone trying to speak. Paula, yes.
Yeah, I would like to mention that through that URL of the RDA FAIR4RS page, you can find all the links that were mentioned. You can find the Zenodo list, and also we had recorded and we've been very transparent with all the work within the group. So you also have access to the minutes to see what has been changing through the years. And in the outputs page, you will find all the other outputs that were presented during this session as well.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording, and if you want to open up your camera and say goodbye, you can.